Welcome to Suzanne's studio, and I'm Suzanne. Tonight I have a very special guest. His name is Mike Lynch, and he is an extremely interesting author. And we've had authors on before. I think you're going to find something very different about Mike. Mike lives in the Bay Area. He's married and he has 2 children, and I'm so glad you're here.
Thank
Mike,
you for having
welcome.
me. Thank you.
Welcome. So you're also an award winner. Tell us about that.
Well, one of the things that you try to do as an author to try to establish yourself as a writer is to try to put your writing into contests, and to increase your chances, the more contests you submit your writing to, the better your chances of winning some awards, and I've been fortunate enough to win a couple. There was a short story that I wrote that was submitted to, it's called The Predators and Editors, sounds kind of nefarious, but yeah. It's called The Predators and Editors Readers Voting kind of a thing. And last year my short story was awarded the top honors for that contest, so that was very nice. One of the books that I wrote that we'll be talking about in a little bit, it's called American Midnight. We submitted it to a contest called the First Chapters Writers Contest, and that won first prize for first chapter in the contest. So again, that was very nice. And then there was another short story that I had written that was also submitted to Predators and Editors the year before, and that came in 3rd place. So I've been fortunate to win some awards. Well,
yeah,
more or less,
yeah. What I have to ask you to begin with, Mike, how in the world did you want to be a writer? Personally, I can't think of anything more difficult. So tell that.
Well,
please.
Like most writers, they grow up reading books, they love stories, they love the idea of characters and plot and those sorts of things. I was the antithesis of that growing up. I didn't like to read. I wasn't much interested in books, which is unusual for a writer. I was more of a TV movie guy. I'm more of a visual learner, so I'm sort of drawn to that genre. But it wasn't until after I was out of high school that I discovered books. So I guess I'm a little bit of a late bloomer. And I was reading a book one day, and I just suddenly had an epiphany of sorts that said, you know what, I can do this. I can be a writer. And so this was back in the early 80s before there were computers, at least personal computers, and so I took out my typewriter and I started pounding away on the typewriter, and I wrote my first novel, and it was pretty terrible because I'd never done this before.
Yeah.
And it took a lot of years of learning the craft of writing, the discipline of writing, and so I wrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it. And it wasn't until the early 90s, so it was about a decade later, that I felt comfortable enough as a writer to start submitting it to different places. And like most writers, inevitably you're going to get the rejection letters. That's just how it is in writing because the competition is pretty fierce. And so it took a number of years before I finally found a publisher for my first novel.
So how do you, I'm thinking of 2 particular questions. One is, how do you get the idea of either, I know you do fiction and nonfiction and articles and short stories, but how do you get these ideas? I mean, you have to have a very fertile mind.
Well, I think the one benefit of growing up with television and movies is I've seen many over the years, and so you get all these kinds of stories and characters and themes and ideas in your head, and for the writer, they want to get them out again. You bring them in and you get them out. And so there's just a story that sounds interesting to you that you want to explore as a writer, and so you start developing the characters, you start developing the plot, what are kind of the psychologies of the different characters that you want to insert into the story that make it more interesting, give it more depth. And it's just sort of this organic process of just establishing the character and the stories and just seeing what comes out. Because when I do my writing, I have a general idea of what I want to write about, but it's not so segmented that I don't know, I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go half the time.
Oh, you don't? So it develops as you write it?
Yes, I have a sort of a skeletal idea of what I want to write about, sort of a beginning, middle, and end, but where in the middle parts, I just sort of let the writing write itself.
Really? How does that happen? I want to know.
It just
It
does.
just happens.
Well, one of the things that they talk about is in a story, you have to be true to the character. Who is this character that I've created? And you have to honor that character, whether they're a hero or a villain or somebody in between or a minor character. But you want them to go in a direction that's true to the story, so that in some ways the story has to write itself depending on which way you want it to go. And so that's where that you sort of figured out as you understand the characters, that's where the story goes, based on who the character is.
But I think you have to be very, very creative to become, practically, am I right, to become the character? Like something is coming through you as the character?
At some level, yes, you have to become the character at some level,
Yeah.
and you also have to understand who the character is, where they've come from, which is often many parts of it are before the story starts, but in your mind, you've created, at some level, a childhood, hurts or pains that they've suffered in life, areas where they've had shortcomings. And you incorporate that into the character, so when they act a certain way in certain circumstances, that's honoring the character because that's he or she really is. And you have to imagine these sorts of things. You have to sort of live their lives at different levels, because if it's a main character, their lives are very, very deep and there's a lot in them. And the minor characters, it's not so much, but there's enough there to give them structure and form, so that when they behave in a certain way, that's how they're supposed to behave in the context of the greater story.
But don't you think, I mean, I don't mean to be putting words in, I'm just thinking myself, don't you have to put a lot of yourself into it, not practically autobiographical?
I think you have to put parts of yourself into, because when you have a story, you have the protagonist who is the hero. They're trying to resolve whatever conflicts that they have to face in the story. I like to write about flawed heroes, because that's a real person. None of us is absolutely perfect. We're not Superman, where we're completely virtuous and honorable.
Really? I thought you were. I wouldn't have had you on the show,
Well, I hate
Mike.
to break the news to you, but we all have our faults and our flaws.
Yeah.
And I like to write about characters who a lot of times want to do the right thing, for example, but because of something in their past, they don't always do the right thing. And they sort of go off path a little bit. And then, of course, you have the antagonist in the story, which is more of the villain. And generally, we don't think of ourselves as villainous people, but in order to have an interesting story, you have to have somebody who's trying to keep the protagonist in the story from fulfilling whatever goals they're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not my personality per se. I don't try to stop people from achieving things in their lives, but there's a part of us that does, otherwise I couldn't write about it. And so you take parts of your personality and your character and you incorporate them into the characters in the story.
Because I'm sure we have a lot of prospective writers that are going to watch the show, Mike. Mm-hmm. One of my questions is, how do you keep yourself focused? It requires so much discipline to sit in front of whatever. Some people write by longhand, mm-hmm. but the typewriter, the computer. How do you discipline yourself day after day?
You have to love what you're doing. I mean, it's just a passion that you have to write, that you have stories that you have to tell. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a novelist. I mean, that's one aspect of writing. I also enjoy writing short stories because they don't take near as long, and it's easier to submit them to different magazines, and you get feedback from them a lot quicker than you do if you're a novelist. But you have stories that are just, you have to put them on the paper. That's just who you are as a writer.
I see.
I mean, like I said before, I didn't have any interest in writing, but when I was older, all of a sudden I found myself just writing stories just for fun. I just sort of stumbled into it. I wasn't intending to be a writer. It was just, I think this would be an interesting story to tell, and I just got my typewriter and I wrote it. And then a few months later, there was another story I wanted to tell, and I wrote it, and I just would put it in a folder, and I didn't think anything of it. Well, that's who a writer is. They just start writing because of their personality and because of just what they want to do with their lives. That's just a creative outlet. And so you have to love what you're doing. You have to want to do this, because most writers are not going to succeed, at least in a professional sense. They're not going to become professional writers because it's so difficult to get published, because the competition is very, very fierce, especially for novelists. And so you have to have a thick skin, too, because you get a lot of rejection letters, and I'm no exception. It took me 2 years before I got my first book published, and there was a lot of rejection letters that preceded that.
But it did not discourage you.
Usually it didn't. I mean, I'm human. There were times when I would get that rejection letter in the mail, and you just sort of, you know, after a while you start thinking, do I really want to keep doing this? Do I really want to subject myself to this self-inflicted punishment of getting a rejection? Because when you write and you put your story out there, it's there for the whole world to see. And when the whole world says we're not interested, no thank you, it can be hard sometimes because it feels like a personal rejection, even though it's not really, but it feels like it sometimes. And you are tempted to quit. And there were a couple of times myself when I just thought maybe I'm just not going to make it. But I had invested so much time and energy and years into writing stories that I thought, do I really want to give up so quickly? And so I kept persevering and persevering and persevering until it finally paid off.
And how did it make you feel when it paid off, when you got that letter saying, I want your book?
Well, it was a little bit unusual. I didn't get a letter. it was an email from the publisher.
Oh, okay.
And I sent a query to the publisher and gave him my email address in case he wanted to contact me if he had any questions about the story. And he sent an email, and he said that we are interested in your book, and we want to publish it. And I couldn't believe it. I was absolutely stunned. You know, it's something you dream and hope for, but when it actually happens, it's you know, you can't believe it. And I remember I was sitting in front of the computer. My wife came into the room, and I had this look on my face of shock, and she thought something was wrong, and she goes, "What's wrong? What happened?" And I said, I couldn't even speak, and I said, "Just read that." That's all I can get out was read that. And then she started crying, because she had been there in the trenches with me year after year after year, and just, you know, my pain was her pain. And so she was just so happy for me and so thrilled that it had finally happened, and I had fulfilled a dream that took many, many years. So it was exciting.
Question, very important question. After you publish your first book, how do you continue with future books?
Well, I was a little bit scared, actually, because I had spent, from when I first wrote the novel, my first novel, when I wrote it in 1981, and it didn't actually get published until 2 years ago. So it was almost 30 years between start and stop. Now, I didn't write it for 30 years, and that's all I did for 30 years. There were a lot of years when I didn't touch it at all, but I would kind of tinker with it, put it away, tinker with it, put it away, kind of a thing. And so that was a story that I knew very well, obviously. And once I had finished that one, there was a little bit of a fear of, can I write anything else? Is there another story in me that I write a novel? And it was at this time that there was another author that I got to know. His name is Brandon Barr, and he helped me with the first novel. I had written it, but then I couldn't sell it, and so I brought him in as an editor and basically made him a co-author because he edited the whole book. And so after we were done, he emailed me a few months after we were going to get it published. And he said that he really enjoyed the process. He liked working with me. Do we want to work on a second project? And I said, well, I have a few ideas for some stories. And so I sent them out to him. And there was one that he liked, and that was American Midnight, which we eventually got published as our second book.
How exciting, but it's like being an actor and auditioning, and you have to have very thick skin, which obviously you do. Now, I know, certainly I know, I would love to hear a couple of passages from your book.
Well,
would you like to read something to us?
I would love to read. I brought my books with me, and there was this one passage, and it's just one that's just kind of fun and exciting. It's for American Midnight. And I don't know how good of a reader I'll be, but I'll do my best.
Of course.
Let's see. Where is the section? Jeff dove into the back seat just as Greg slammed the stick into gear and hit the gas. A mixture of burning rubber and squealing tires tore the air. In the rearview mirror, he watched in horror when the soldier picked up the gun and pointed it in their direction. "Everyone, get down," he shouted. Even before the words left his mouth, a number of hits danced all around them. The back window shattered, scattering glass through the air. Other hollow-tipped rounds passed through the thin metal skin as though it were made of paper. In a desperate bid to get out of line of fire, Greg swerved the car back and forth, "Jeff," he barked, "don't just sit there, shoot back." He brought up a rifle and fired through the shattered rear window. The soldier dove to the ground as multiple hits registered on the wall behind him, spitting out chunks of cement. When he came up again and took aim, Greg jerked the wheel and sent them skidding around the bend in the road and out of sight. "Is everyone all right?" asked Greg. Everyone looked at each other. "I think we're okay," Tanya replied. Greg turned forward again and didn't let up on the gas. The old gravel road was treacherous at those speeds, but he didn't dare slow down. Without any warning, a small hole punched through the middle of the windshield and jagged lines spider-webbed outwards. A second hit shattered the windshield to pieces, raining broken glass on Greg and Daniel. Greg ducked down behind the dashboard, trying desperately to keep the car on the road. When he took the next turn, gunfire exploded on their left, peppering the vehicle with multiple hits. Jeff lunged over to shield Tanya just as a round struck him square in the chest. He let out a cry and slumped backwards in his seat. "Tanya!" Tanya let out a shriek. "Jeff!" Greg reacted sharply and spun the wheel away from the muzzle flashes. The sudden change in direction shifted Tanya's momentum, and her head slammed against the cab. When the car fishtailed toward a clump of trees, Greg jerked the wheel back, which sent them careening toward a 300-foot ravine. "Hang on," he screamed before turning the car in the opposite direction. Another volley of weapons fire erupted from the side of the road. The rear wheel exploded, flinging out chunks of shredded rubber. Suddenly, all became silent except for the grinding coming from the bare rim running against the rocky forest ground. Somehow, Greg had come upon an old fire road. Up ahead, he saw the main mountain highway through the trees. "Greg," Katie screamed, "you have to do something. Jeff's been shot." End of chapter.
That's pretty exciting.
Anyway.
Which is your first book?
The first novel was When the Sky Fell. It's a science fiction novel.
Oh, you're a very interesting talent.
Well, thank you.
But you do a variety of stories. So
I do like to write a variety of stories, which actually is to my detriment, because most writers really should stick with one genre, because that's what they are known for. So, for example, if you think of a Tom Clancy or a Stephen King, who are very famous novelists, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Stephen King writes horror and supernatural thrillers, and Tom Clancy writes military adventure type stories, and that's the kind of story that they write about over and over again because that's their genre. While I should do that as a writer, I just have so many interests in so many different areas that I'd rather write stories, to me, that are more interesting to write about, even though I can't get the quote-unquote following as a writer that I would normally get, but I'm a storyteller, and so I've written a book about Dublin, the history of Dublin, because
tell that. Yeah.
Yeah, my family is from there originally. My family came from Ireland during the great exodus from Ireland in the 1850s because of the potato famine, and so my family, the Devaney's, landed in San Francisco in 1852, and 6 years later landed in Dublin, and were there for many, many years. And my great-grandfather is buried near Dublin, and so because he wasn't actually buried in Dublin, the family was sort of forgotten, and so I grew up with stories about how we were sort of cheated from the history of Dublin because our family is not there anymore, and so I was asked by the Dublin Heritage Center to write a history of the town, and so it was my opportunity to sort of reinsert my family back into the history of the town of Dublin. So that was kind of a little mission that I had for my family. And then, of course, I wrote my sci-fi novel, and then American Midnight, which I just read from, is sort of a contemporary political thriller. And then next year I have another novel coming out, and that's kind of like an Indiana Jones meets the Da Vinci Code kind of archaeology adventure story. So,
Mike, do you have to do a lot of research?
Some research, of course. For example, the novel that's coming out next year is, because it's based in history, I had to do a lot of historical research. But for me, that's something I really enjoy, because when I was in college, I was a history major. So, I have a love and a passion for history. So that's fun for me to go back and read about historical characters and events. So,
do you ever write any hot romantic novels?
Not per se. I'm not a romantic novelist. A
Really?
romance novelist, I guess, is a better way to say
How come?
it. I'd rather write about adventure and intrigue and things like that.
Yeah.
That's just something that I'm more drawn to. Although one of the things that I'm mindful of is that 80% of readers are women who read books. That's
80%?
80%.
I didn't know that.
It's a very high number of women versus men who read fiction. Men read more nonfiction, and women tend to read more fiction. And so because women are your primary audience, you have to have those elements. So I do have those romance elements in the story to make it more interesting, but I always like to have the adventure and the things in the story that be the part that I want to write about mostly.
What's your new book about?
It's an archaeology story. It's entitled After the Cross, and it takes place mostly in the Middle East, where a very ancient letter is found where the writer has said that the cross of Jesus still exists, and if you want to find it, here's where you find it, kind of a thing. And so it becomes sort of an adventure archaeology story, sort of like an Indiana Jones-ish kind of a thing, hunting for treasure.
How far along are you in the book?
Oh, the book is done.
Oh, it's
the book is
done.
Finished, and it's going to come out hopefully in either March, April of next year.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Now, do you continue writing?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, you do. You don't.
Yeah.
I mean, just because you've sold 100,000 books doesn't mean.
I wish I sold 100,000 books.
Yeah.
Yeah. You always have to keep writing because the publishers, when they are working with an author, what they want to know is what do you have coming up next? What's your next project that you're working on? Because they spend a lot of time and money and energy into you and nurture you as a writer, because my success is their success. And so they don't want somebody who only has one book in them, because then once the book is done, then there's nowhere to go. So you're always working on your next project. What story is interesting to you? So I have that book coming out, and then I'm in the middle of writing another book, which is almost done. So that's going to be my project for the year after that.
We only have a few minutes left, and I would love for you to give some advice for young writers, old people writing. I mean, tell us, because you're successful, thank goodness.
I'm very fortunate to get published, yes.
Well, obviously you're very modest too. But so what would your advice be, Mike, to people that really are passionate about what they do, but they really don't know how to go about it?
There's so many ways I can answer that question, but to answer it quickly, you have to spend a lot of time on the computer or on the typewriter. It takes a lot of practice to become, like anything else, it takes practice and practice and practice. And it also takes the willingness to share your stories with other people, to have them critique it. Because when I first started out, like I mentioned, when I first wrote my first novel, it was really pretty awful. Because I'd never done it before and I didn't know what I was doing. And it wasn't until I started showing it to other people and getting critiqued and having them pointing out areas of weakness as a writer that I was suffering from, because I couldn't see it, but they could see it. That really helped me a lot. Although it's not fun to hear where your writing suffers, but you benefit from it when you start to correct those problems. And so you have to practice, 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 showing your work to other writers so they can critique it. And also going to writers' conferences is a really good way to start making relationships with other writers, with editors, with agents, and start kind of networking, getting your name out there, because it's through the relationships that doors open up. And so I cannot recommend more the benefits of going to a writers' conference. Very, very helpful in my case. And so practice, getting involved in a writers group is helpful, because then you can share your stories with other people, or they share them with you and you can see how other writers write and what their process is and learn from them. So it's lonely on the one hand because you're typing your story alone, but on the other hand you want to have friends who can support you and be there for you.
Well, this is very, very good advice. I'm so glad you have been on Suzanne's studio. And when you become even more famous, which of course you're so famous now, but we'll do this again, and we'll have you talk more. But thank you so much for being
here. Me. I appreciate it.
And I think the advice that you have given the the audience, the prospective writers, but you still have to be of a certain mentality to be able to stick to it, and obviously you have succeeded. And I wish you all the best. And you're from the Bay Area, you'll probably always stay here. Mm-hmm. And your name is Mike Lynch, L-Y-N-C-H, and you have a great web page, and I think we've put that on the screen. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you. Appreciated being here.
You're welcome. And I always say this because KMVT, you know, we are all volunteers. So I am so fortunate because it's such a wonderful station and my crew is hot. And I don't say cool, I say hot. And they're the best and I thank them so much. And I really also want to thank my audience for watching and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye-bye.